My screen. Dude, I thought I shut these off. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Neil Quan with QuonWarrene, and I wanted to welcome you to the uh, March 2017 um, QuonWarrene Financial Technology Spotlight. This month, we are excited to bring a new spin and a new tool to bear for our discussion on tools that are helping advisors prepare for what was the pending or upcoming DOL rule that was supposed to go live, but we now know that there may be likely a delay in that. So before we get to that, before I introduce today's guest speaker, I wanted to very quickly go over the agenda. Today our discussion will probably be no more than an hour. Typically our webinars go for about 40 minutes, and that this webinar is also being recorded. So if there's an opportunity for you to revisit this webinar at your leisure, you can do so. And you also have the ability to share this with other people within your spheres of influence who might find today's discussion interesting. And we also ask you or encourage you to participate in today's webinar by asking or submitting questions through our chat feature within the webinar tool. So as we get started, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mark Friedenthal, who is the founder and CEO of Tolerisk. Tolerisk is one of the newer tools that have emerged in the financial technology space, specifically in the area of risk assessment. Mark brings to the fintech arena a vast degree of experience and a background in institutional risk management, where he had previously had a stint at GE Capital, Cendent, and Citigroup. And he's also worked previously as a registered investment advisor. So with those, that combination of his background and professional experience has allowed him to have a perspective on discerning and assessing risk for the clients that he works with. And he actually used that experience to birth Tolerisk, where he really found that traditional risk assessment tools really only looked at a client's willingness or their personality, i.e. willingness to accept risk. And his discussion really found that there was really a need to measure a client's ability to accept risk. And so that's what he's here to talk about today. And it's my pleasure to turn it over to Mark Friedenthal.
Neil, thanks so much. I really appreciate you having me here today. So we're going to talk about all things risk tolerance, and I'm frankly just excited to have other people that are interested in talking about risk tolerance, which is great. So we're going to jump right in. So there are a few things we're going to cover today. We're going to talk a little bit about how risk tolerance assessments and that process has evolved over the years. We'll go through some of the common pitfalls and weaknesses that advisors are facing. We'll talk about why improving the risk tolerance assessment process is important. So who cares really? And we are going to touch, Neil had mentioned the fiduciary rule, the DOL rule that has been so topical these days. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and how that's impacting risk tolerance assessments. We're also going to touch on mortality probabilities and talk about some common misconceptions as well. And ultimately, what you can do to really use a scientific risk tolerance process to improve your practice. By the way, I know there's a lot of material. Feel free to jump in if you have questions. We can kind of go and address them as they come. So first, how have things really evolved in terms of risk tolerance assessments? So traditionally, you've seen a one-dimensional assessment. It's been, usually 6 to 12 multiple choice questions, and it's been categorical in output. So the result from that quiz is one of 3 to 5 buckets. Things like aggressive, moderate, and conservative were common nomenclature for the output of the client's risk tolerance questionnaire or assessment. So in the last 10 years, more so in the last 5, but in the last 10, we've seen things become more numerical, more granular in terms of their output. So instead of having these large categories, there was more granularity in the output. And we've certainly seen them become cloud-based, which is nice. We have a link that can be put on a website or can be emailed or uploaded to a client's portal. So some nice features that have kind of grown in the last several years. But let's talk for a second about where really the cutting edge approach to risk tolerance assessment is. It's really a more scientific advantage in that we're going from a single dimension to 2 dimensions. One dimension being the client's willingness to accept risk. That's really based on their personality towards risk taking. And then the second dimension, you can see here across the top, is their ability. Sometimes that's called capacity to take risk. And this is really a function of the chronology of their cash flows. And it's really very independent from their personality. And what we need is to take both of these independent dimensions or axes and combine them into something that's simple, that's measurable, actionable, that can be used by advisors and communicated with their clients. So let's talk about some of the common pitfalls or weaknesses that have been around in the area of risk tolerance assessment. So the first one is that there's been a reliance on these nebulous buckets. You know, most people leave that traditional exercise being categorized as moderate, and you can't see my air quotes around moderate. That's challenging because moderate means different things to different people, even different advisors. There isn't a clear objective definition around some of these buckets. So when we have a categorical type output, part of the challenge or part of the weakness is that it tends to inspire a very few changes throughout the investor's horizon. So in other words, you switch from one large bucket to another. And so there aren't that many times or that many dates in which that's occurring. So we'll take a look here. This is obviously an oversimplified picture, but you can imagine that for some, when they're younger, they're investing in what one might describe as an aggressive allocation. And then one day, for any number of reasons, they switch to moderate. And then one day they switch to conservative, often when they retire or about when they retire. So the challenge, of course, is in this diagram, you see this client's made 2 large changes over their entire investing horizon. Now, if they happen to pick good days to make those changes, then that could be great. But if they pick lousy 2 days, a lousy set of days, then it could be terrible. And it just places a great onus on the actual dates that those large categorical changes are made. So most assessments focus way too much on personality, which is a challenge. Some have some other adjustments, but historically speaking, that's been a major pitfall. They really haven't accounted for the cash flows that can be quite salient in determining the right level of risk for a client. So some of the exercises make some adjustments based on either age or time until retirement. These are common even in some of the older quizzes and certainly some of the newer technologies. But those adjustments, as we said, they're linear because they're on one dimension. Those assessments are one-dimensional. So when adjustments made based on age for a younger client, the risk tolerance assessment, the output is ratcheted up. And when the client is a little older, it's ratcheted down. But it's the same adjustment based on age without deference to all of the other factors. They're linearly combined with those other personality factors. So let's take a look at some simple examples, and we'll talk about why things like age might not necessarily be big drivers. In some cases, they are, by the way, but not in all cases, and that's why it has to be a more scientific analysis. So this one, we're going to call this person client 1. Pretty simple. We're saying they're 25. They're going to retire in 40 years. In this case, the point to be highlighted is they have a $200,000 capital need let's say they're buying a house and they have $225,000 currently. So most of the money they have, boy, they're pretty good savers at 25. They have $225,000. That's pretty good. So of that, 200,000 is going to be used in 2 years. We'll say that is going towards a house. I suppose in the Midwest, that might be buying the whole house, and on the coast, perhaps that's just the down payment on that house. But in any case, that's our example. In this example, this client's ability to take risk is very low because they're using most of the capital in a relatively short period of time. So even though they are very young, their ability to take risk is pretty low. Contrast that with the same or another 25-year-old that also has $225,000, this time in a 401k. Boy, that is really fantastic. And they don't have any specific capital needs. So for them, generally speaking, their ability to take risk is high. Now, of course, these are dramatic oversimplifications, but I think you get the comparison at least. So let's go back. We'll reference client number one. It's the same situation. So a lot of their money is being used in 2 years. So low ability to take risk. And let's compare that to client number two, our new client number two, who's 65, just retired, doesn't have any capital needs, also has the same $225,000 in their retirement account. And we have a little bit more information about this individual. They spend $5,000 a month. They take in $2,500 in Social Security. They have a pension with a cost of living adjustment that's $3,500. Well, boy, isn't that wonderful? They spend $5,000 and they have $6,000 in income that has a cost of living adjustment. So their ability to take risk is quite high, even though they're retired. And just again, an illustration that sometimes age is not necessarily a big factor and certainly impacts the analysis in different ways based on all this other information. So let's take a look at some other common weaknesses. We talked about those. So one of the other ones is there's no analysis on the sensitivity to the assumptions made. So in other words, even if you perform a more scientific process, which for a lot of advisors is hard to do, part of what they're challenged by is they don't know the drivers of the output. And even in some of the more simplistic tools, they don't know the drivers of the output. And what advisors often share with us is that they ask clients questions and the clients don't always know the answers. The clients guess. And so it becomes important for advisors to know which answers are most critical. If something's critical, then they may need to button it down if the client doesn't really know the answer. And if something's not so critical, then it's much easier for the advisor not to dwell on it, not to you force the client to spend any more time on it because it may not contribute to the decisions at hand. And so sort of that sensitivity analysis is very helpful in some cases. This is an example, by the way, of a sensitivity analysis where we can see on the top the Tolerisk score, which is that recommended risk directive. So our Tolerisk score is calibrated to be the numerator in a stocks to bonds benchmark. So in this case, a 73 would be about 73% in stocks or other risky or growth assets, and the balance, in this example, 27% in low risk assets. So what you see on the screen is an example of a sensitivity analysis where every input is shocked up and down instantly, and you can see how much each one of those contributes to that score, that output of 73. And we're going to take a look, by the way, you could have two different clients, both who have the identical risk tolerance assessment or recommended risk level, in this case, Tolerisk score. You could have another client with a Tolerisk score also of 73 that got there in very different ways. And you'll find that their sensitivity analysis could be quite different. So here's one, also 73, but we see much greater sensitivity to changing the retirement date or even just as they age. Even if nothing else changes, this one's going to move a lot more than the previous one.
So Mike, just a quick question. It's really interesting. And so you're really showing that, a risk score, we'll use your number here, 73, that could be, as you said, very nebulous, but in a way, you're really trying to bring then some objectivity or relative, relative relationships of what that really means to that individual client.
Right. So this 73 is anything but nebulous, right? Advisors have an easy time explaining that 73 means about 73% in stocks or other assets that bear material risk. Could be alternatives, could be REITs, could be other things, but it's 73% of the portfolio in what you would describe as growth-oriented risk-type assets. So it alleviates that nebulous description of moderate or moderately aggressive or something like that. And it allows us to do a quantitative analysis like this. So we can see what drove it. How is it going to change? Are we affected by tax rates even? You see, that's one of the shocks. I mean, we don't know what tax rates are going to be in 2017, let alone when our 50-year-old client retires. So at least we can identify whether in this particular case, it's an important assumption or it's not. In this example, it's really not going to drive that decision. Age is an important one on the screen we're examining, but age, we know the answer. So we don't have to worry about being wrong in a sense about that. Retirement age, the client may be guessing. And at least this gives us some, in this case, this particular assessment happens to be fairly sensitive to that. Others may not be sensitive to it at all. And at least the advisor has the tools to decide whether they want to delve in a little deeper or they let it go because it's just not changing the client's decision at this time. It may become more salient later. And so later on, the advisor may coach the client to get a little bit more thoughtful in some of these assumptions. But, and in the example on this screen, actually, it is a big assumption, but that won't always be the case. So one of the other things that is a weakness of most of the exercises out there is they don't generally depict how the risk directive will likely evolve. And that's a challenge when they are primarily personality-based. By rooting ours in cash flows and by using a two-dimensional assessment, you can actually, we borrow from the institutional risk metrics, and we can compute a forward curve, much the way an interest rate forward curve is computed mathematically, of that Tolerisk score, of that likely risk directive. And really what it's doing is it's moving every cash flow in every array forward year by year and recomputing that risk directive. It's helpful for a few reasons. We'll look at one. Actually, we're going to look at a couple here. One, so this is an example of someone whose Tolerisk score, their recommended risk directive starts out in the high 70s and gradually declines until about retirement and settles in roughly at about 60% equities and 40% bonds or low risk assets. This is not that exciting looking a chart per se, but these will be very different based on the confluence of assumptions for your client, and they will change. So we would never advocate simply setting it and forgetting it. It's definitely something that should be revisited as new information becomes available. But what this does, advisors tell us, is that it really illustrates just how customized the advisor's wealth management process is to this client, which is helpful. It gives the client a sense about how things will likely change. Many people fear change, so the more information you can give them about how things will likely evolve, generally helpful. So by having the confidence associated with knowing that this exercise is so thorough, it's so tailored to them, advisors tell us all the time that clients that used to call up in that panicky voice when the market dips and say, oh my goodness, are we taking too much risk? Don't do that, or certainly don't do it as readily or as often. And that helps obviously in a variety of manners. Besides saving the advisor some time, it also lends itself to discipline on the client's part. And we know how important good discipline is to being a successful investor. And then beyond that, there are things that kind of derive from that. That confidence breeds better retention and it breeds more referrals. And so from a business development perspective, this is a real helpful chart. And as I mentioned, it's going to be very different for each client. We'll run through a couple. Here's one that's flat completely out of the gate. This is probably somebody who is never going to touch this money. They may even be retired already. They could be 90 years old. And if they live so conservatively on their pension and Social Security income, then as they get deeper into retirement and they're not getting any closer to utilization of the capital, and therefore, wouldn't really have any specific reason to change risk directives. For them, it's going to be all about personality. So you might see a much lower flat curve commensurate with somebody's personality. But there are certainly lots of examples. You could have a young person as well. If they don't have capital expenditures along the course, their ability to take risk could be quite high if they're very long dated usage, in which case it could be very flat in this case. Here's an example of somebody that has a large capital expenditure. So early on, they have a pretty low risk directive. And then once that's removed, the remaining assets have a pretty long average life. We see it's pretty flat for a while. And as they get deeper into retirement or closer to retirement, we see that appropriate risk level comes down as they get closer to using their capital. Here's another one. This is an interesting one. You could have a young person who initially is essentially saving for their rainy day. Should they lose their job, they sort of need to develop that cushion. And very early on, it may be that all their money goes towards that cushion. And you can see it kind of, the effect of that rainy day allotment becomes smaller and smaller a few years in because they're saving more money, their money is growing. So the amount that they need as a rainy day allocation becomes a smaller and smaller part of their portfolio. So again, you'll see a lot of different shapes based on the specific circumstances of your client. So why is improving risk tolerance assessments? Why is that important? Who cares, really? And I think that's an interesting and an important question. So I like to think of risk tolerance assessment as a bit of a Goldilocks exercise. If you stick with the analogy, you don't want the porridge to be too hot. You don't want the porridge to be too cold, meaning you don't want the risk of a portfolio for an investor or client to be too great. You don't want it to be too low either. If they take too much risk, then they might not be able to meet some financial obligation because the portfolio could have declined and the money is not there. Alternatively, they may just not be able to stomach the volatility, even if they're not using it. So you can see their cash flows as well as their personality certainly play a big part. And what about the opposite? What if they're taking too little risk? What if the porridge is too cold, so to speak? Well, in that case, they're not going to get as much enjoyment out of the fruits of their labor. And enjoyment can be different things to different people. Enjoyment for one might be when they retire. For another, it might be how they retire. And yet a third, it could be what they leave their heirs, their children, grandchildren, their charities. However your client defines enjoyment, we know over the long run, historically speaking, that portfolios with less risk generally produce less growth and less return. So taking too little risk does have a negative impact as well. So a more scientific process, we talked about a little bit, it inspires more confidence, it facilitates discipline, and it improves retention and referrals. So that's certainly a pretty welcome part of the exercise. And by the way, I'll go back a second. In addition to inspiring confidence in clients, it's also very useful in improving conversion. So with your prospect, it's a way that advisors tell us they differentiate by using a scientific process versus those using very simplistic personality profiles. So it can actually be used even as a way to improve conversion. And then the last bullet you see here is that when you're using a scientific approach, one that incorporates cash flows, mortality probabilities, that demonstrates a greater level of fiduciary care and a strong culture of compliance. And because the DOL fiduciary rule is just so darn topical these days, we are going to spend a little bit more time talking about that as well. But first, we're going to go through kind of the important factors that should be included in a scientific risk tolerance assessment. So the first one is personality. It's the client's willingness to accept risk, and it is very important. So while other models, other tools focus almost exclusively on it, we're not minimizing the importance of it. It is absolutely very important. It's the degree of importance that changes depending on the other confluence of assumptions and circumstances. So in addition to having an assessment of somebody's willingness to accept risk, you have to have a comprehensive ability, a cash flow analysis, which is how you're going to analyze their ability or capacity to take risks. So the kinds of things that would be included: their age, their anticipated retirement age, savings and expenses, as well as their asset base, their retirement income streams. And then outside of savings and expenses, you have sort of the big tickets, the capital expenditures, the things that aren't in the regular expenses, or you have the capital inflows that might not be in the typical monthly or annual savings either. And then, of course, there are market assumptions about returns and inflation and tax rates and things of that kind of nature. So we're going to go through a couple screenshots here just to give you an idea. And obviously this comes from Tolerisk, but you know, I'm really just using it as an illustration. So you see, we recommend modeling spouses separately when available. That helps not only in dealing with timing of RMDs on retirement accounts, or perhaps income generated in retirement, Social Security, pension, things like that, but also when it comes to mortality probabilities. They are different by individual, and you may want to model them as such. So we do advocate modeling spouses separately. When it comes to cash flows, it's ideal if you can be tax sensitive. Will it work without that? Sure. It's all about how tailored you can and choose to make the exercise for the client. So here in this example, you see 3 different tax statuses. You see taxable, so the traditional brokerage or checking, savings, money market kinds of accounts. You see pre-tax retirement, and you also see Roth type retirement, although we don't have any value in that on this screen. Below, you start to see expenses. And by the way, you'll notice we have customized buttons here. Sometimes you might model cash flows using really simple arrays, a certain number of dollars per month or per year. And other times you might say, boy, it's just not that simple, and you really need to account for some customization. And we'll kind of get in some examples. With expenses, we have on screen here $10,000 a month. But what if this client is paying off their mortgage in 7 years? And so maybe it's $10,000 now, but it's $8,500 in today's dollars thereafter. So there are some things that you might want to consider for purposes of that. So I'm just scrolling down here. In addition to those expenses, we have capital expenditures. We'll go through that in a second. Capital inflows, and we go through modeling assets. Again, if you can model them in different tax statuses, that's ideal. And then retirement income, and you'll want to account for income that is going to adjust with inflation versus income that won't adjust. Here on screen, you see a Social Security, you see a defined benefit pension, and you may even have other income streams that require a little bit more customization, certain annuities or things that only pay for a fixed period of time, things like that. So this is an example of capital needs. So we have Jane's college, $50,000 a year, starting in the year 2021 for 4 years. And whenever you're modeling cash flows, you are going to want to be mindful of inflation. So whether you're modeling something that is a present value or a future value, just be aware of it. And certainly it's nice if your technology has an easy way for you to represent that. We have Jane's wedding. We have purchase of a beach house. These would be examples of capital needs. So capital inflows, this would be money coming into the portfolio. We have a few examples on screen: sale of a business, downsizing a home. You might also even have a likely inheritance, could be money coming into a portfolio. So you'll want to take care of some of the financial assumptions, and you'll want to account for personality. Sometimes when you're dealing with spouses, it may be advantageous for you to let them contribute in a sense separately, have those personality profiles done separately so you can see how divergent their propensity to take risk is. And you may choose to either use an average, or you may choose to weight more towards the more conservative spouse. Or you'll find in some cases, advisors tell us spouses tend to like to answer the questions together. They may, amongst themselves, defer to one spouse over another. But it's nice to have the options, and you at least want to be aware of it if if you end up placing a great onus on personality, you'll want to know, in a sense, where it stands if you have two individuals contributing. Tax rates, as we mentioned, you can get as granular as you need. Ours is not tax planning software, but we do like to differentiate between pre and post retirement. And for most, this is an educated guess. As we said, we don't know tax rates in 2017, let alone when this client perhaps retires. When it comes to investment growth rate, it's interesting. You can use static growth rates, but what we find advisors prefer is to use a growth rate that's commensurate with the risk directive. So one that's been computed based on history and commensurate with these cash flows and personalities. So that's a nice option that you'll see here, that calculate estimate on screen. When it comes to life expectancy, we'll talk a little bit more about mortality probabilities. The traditional financial planning exercise uses typically a specified terminus date. Maybe when Mr. Jones turns 90, his 90th birthday, and that's okay. I think historically that's kind of been considered the best that could be done. There's usually a Monte Carlo simulation that simulates portfolio returns and estimates the probability that money will be around for the end of Mr. Jones's life. What we've discovered is that it's very unlikely that Mr. Jones will pass away on his 90th birthday. In fact, there's a lot of variance around mortality probabilities, and we'll get into that. But what we've found is more effective is to represent the probability year by year for each client. And that's really helpful in creating a more robust assessment of not only somebody's risk tolerance, but also their probability of running out of money, which is important. And we'll talk a little bit about that. The advisors that we talk to are very cautious about providing risk tolerance advice if it's not based on a tenable assumption. So we're going to take a look at what an output screen might be. These are really the answers to the two most common questions that advisors tell us their clients ask. One is, what should I do now? Or what should we do now? What is the right level of risk? In this example, we're saying 66. So 66% in stocks or other risky or growth type assets, 34% in low risk assets. And then the other question is, what's the probability that we're going to outlive our money? In this example, we're saying 15%. Why is that important? Well, besides the obvious, it's important the client wants to know. It's how they feel comfortable. But beyond that, for advisors, especially those who are fiduciaries, they really have a responsibility to make sure that their advice is based on a practical set of assumptions. So if hypothetically this probability for this client of running out of money were 57%, well, obviously this would be unacceptable to most anybody. And the advisor probably wouldn't want to give advice on a risk directive based on that set of assumptions. They would want to work with the client to figure out what's most practical. Is it working longer? Is it saving more and spending less? Is it downsizing the house or selling the vacation home in order to retire when they want? These might all be options. So that's why computing these things concurrently is so important. Okay. So this is just an illustration of that two-dimensional assessment that we've kind of been talking about. The typical exercise, and you saw the little cartoon version early in our slideshow, but this gives you a feel for, in this example, the client's ability, which is across the axis at the top, is fairly high, which means most of their usage is fairly long dated. And then their willingness to accept risk is kind of middle of the road, it appears. And for us, our model is calibrated so that the intersection is always going to be the numerator in a stocks to bonds benchmark. And that's, without going into too much detail, that's part of the secret sauce, so to speak. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about fiduciary standards and how that impacts risk tolerance assessments. I'm going to actually put up a couple quotes here, which I know you guys can read on screen. First one's from Michael Kitces, who did a great job articulating this. He said the reality reality is that being a fiduciary actually entails two core duties. First is the duty of loyalty, which is to act in the client's best interests, put the client first. And the second is the duty of care, to provide diligent and prudent advice and only in the areas in which the advisor is competent to provide such advice. So what exactly does that mean? And we look to the Fiduciary Institute, which gives an example of fiduciary care. And they say eliciting from clients a sufficient amount of information at the inception of the relationship and updated thereafter periodically to make a reasonable assessment of their sophistication in investment matters and risk tolerance. It's specified here. So what does this all mean? What it means is that fiduciaries really can't ignore something as important and readily available as the client's cash flows when providing advice on something as important as a risk directive. Now, advisors are facing this now. There are a lot of advisors that are already fiduciaries, clearly. And what they've shared with us is that when asked by their regulators, of course, they acknowledge that they do this, but they do it on the side. So in other words, for those who aren't using a scientific process, a two-dimensional process, they are implementing a personality profiling tool. And then they're asking questions generally about large capital needs, putting kids through college, buying a piece of property or a business, things like that. And what they complain about is that they don't always have an objective process to do this, which makes it difficult to be consistent and repeatable across clients, let alone across advisors in a firm. And they have a difficult time documenting it. They can document that they asked the question and that it was answered. So the client said, I'm putting my kids through college and this is what we anticipate spending and when, but they have a difficult time demonstrating that it was part of their advice, that it was included diligently in their advice on a risk directive. So that is the challenge, and that's why more and more advisors are opting for a scientific process to alleviate these things. So many for last couple of years went to a scientific risk tolerance assessment for the more business development oriented benefits. But now we're seeing more and more because of fiduciary standards and because of regulatory compliance. Okay, so mortality probabilities. What do they have to do with risk tolerance? We kind of touched on it a little bit before. But what we're saying is, besides the fact the client wants to know, if they're going to run out of money, and by the way, advisors tell us all the time, the client's most common question if they're retired or retiring soon is, will I run out of money? And what's interesting about the way they word that is they ask it as if it's a binary question. Yes or no, Mr. or Mrs. Advisor, will I run out of money? Or will we run out of money? As if the advisor can answer that as a yes or a no. They can't, of course. And the reason is because there are too many moving parts. We don't know, advisors don't know what the client's portfolio returns will be between now and the end of their investment horizon. They also don't know what the client's going to be spending for the rest of their lives. They may know what they're spending now, but they don't know what inflation is going to be and how their expenses are going to generally increase. And then the third thing is the advisors don't know when the client's going to die. And so evaluating whether the client will or will not run out of money is hardly a yes-no question. And so it's really best done by establishing probabilities. And you do need to account for the variance of returns, the variance of inflation, so changes to expenses, and the variance of mortality. So we talked about most financial planning exercise use presumed terminus and why that's kind of a weakness. One of the best ways to evaluate, especially if you're working with two clients, spouses, is that it's really a second to die probability that is most important. So really what you want to evaluate is, what are the odds that the money will be gone at a time when one or both of these individuals will still be alive? And you are dealing with probabilities. You unfortunately cannot give them a yes or a no answer. And we touched on this one too. Advisors generally don't want to provide advice about risk directives unless they're confident in the assumptions that they're realistic. So your way to evaluate that is the probability that the client will run out of money. If the probability is palatable, and what's interesting, by the way, is that there is no right or wrong answer. You may find you have two different clients, both of whom have a 20% probability of running out of money, and one client finds that to be wonderful because they have an 80% chance of success, so to speak, and the other client might be horrified because they feel that they have a 20% chance of being a burden on their children. So there isn't a right or a wrong. Some answers may be more wrong than others, but there isn't a definitive right or wrong. So one of the other reasons why you need to incorporate mortality probabilities is that part of the connection between the two questions, right? The questions of what's the right level of risk now and what's the probability we'll outlive our money, is that they both need each other. To come up with the right risk directive, as we mentioned, you need to know that it's based on a reasonable set of assumptions. But to come up with the probability of outliving your money, you need to have a realistic assumption about risk, not only now, but every year in the future, because that's how you're going to have the most realistic returns and dispersions of returns. And so these two things are quite, connected. So here's one common misconception that we hear all the time. The misconception is that one can substitute that traditional financial planning exercise of the Monte Carlo simulation, the presumed date of terminus, and that success rate. You can substitute that for the client's ability to take risk. And we went through an example earlier, but we'll pull it up again on the screen here. So, by the way, the reason that this probably is a common misconception is that sometimes the outputs coincide. The client who's spending too much money may have a reduced ability to take risks simply because they're using it quickly. And that same client may have an increased probability of running out of money. So they may appear related, but really they are independent. They just may coincide in those types of scenarios. So let's take a look here. So this is an easy example. We used this one earlier, this shape of Tolerisk score through time, risk directive through time. You might have a client that has a large capital expense. So their ability to take risk is quite low, but their probability of running out of money is also low, meaning their success rate is quite high because they have lots of years in front of them to save money and more than enough to fund their retirement in almost all cases. So that's an easy example why that's really a myth, but it is a very common one. So if you felt that way or thought that, you are definitely not alone. This is an example of kind of a middle of the road assets projection through time. You can kind of see on the left a large capital withdrawal relative to the size of that portfolio, but lots of time to accumulate and grow deep into retirement. So how can you use a scientific risk tolerance assessment to improve your practice? A lot of it is business development type benefits. So greater client confidence, greater impressions with prospects. You sort of wow the prospect with your level of diligence and customization. Your clients are more confident in how customized your risk management, your wealth management process is for them. And they're certainly going to be wowed by your care and diligence, both your prospects and your clients. Regulators really appreciate the culture of compliance and fiduciary care that comes with demonstrating you've used cash flows and things like mortality probabilities in your risk tolerance assessment analysis. So a couple of conclusions here, just to summarize. Willingness to accept risk, absolutely very important. But it's not the only dimension. Also very important to measure the client's ability, sometimes called capacity to take risk, which is really a function of the chronology of their cash flows. And these two dimensions need to be combined in a nonlinear fashion. You can't add them up or average them. Otherwise, it would really only be a one-dimensional assessment. And then utilizing the scientific approach really can add to your practice by improving conversion, increasing retention, increasing your referrals, reduced compliance risk, which not only is a reduction in risk, but can actually even be a reduction in time spent on compliance or with regulators. So that's really all I've got. Neil, I don't know if we have any questions, but happy to field them if anybody does have any questions.
No, Mark, thanks a lot. That was great. I mean, I never really understood. I mean, you definitely have shined the light on really the complexity on really determining a proper risk assessment. So thank you for sharing. We did have a couple of questions come in, so I wanted to make sure that we
Sure.
addressed those. First one is, how are the sensitivities in the Tolerisk score determined? And how do you determine the ranges for the scoring algorithm?
Yeah, so the sensitivities are determined through brute force, meaning they are actually run behind the scenes. They're called parametric tests. They're very common in institutional risk management, which is where we got the concept. So basically, you have the Tolerisk score. The system is essentially changing one input and rerunning the score, and then it changes the input the other direction and it reruns the score, and then it moves on to the next input, and it's just that with computing power these days, that can be done so quickly. It appears instant, but it's really all being computed through brute force behind the scenes. That's a great question.
There's another one. Well, so I guess you covered this just as you were closing, but can you reiterate again? How can we use a system like this from a for prospecting and really how to grow the business?
Yeah. So the screenshots I showed you were from what's called Tolerisk Pro, which is sort of our flagship, and it's highly customizable. It's very detailed. We have had advisors over the last year or so that have asked us for something geared more specifically to prospects. So we developed a few things that are simplified versions of this. So it still delivers the two-dimensional assessment, which is so important. That's what advisors are really seeking. But what we did is we stripped away the customization of cash flows, multiple spouses with differential cash flows and personalities, and custom life expectancies and different tax statuses and things like that. So we turn it into a 5-minute exercise. So it still answers the two important questions, meaning how much risk should I take now and what's the probability I'll outlive my money? And it still uses that scientific process, but we don't allow you to customize all the cash flows and intricacies in that version. Both versions, incidentally, can be embedded on an advisor's website. We give embed code. You can have a button, have a link. You can also just email a link or upload a link or things like that. I think that since we introduced Tolerisk EZ, which is the one geared more towards prospects, we found advisors are more apt to put that one on their website, since that's the sort of the small time commitment on their part. And it really helps them not only provide something of value to a prospect, but also triage a little bit. The prospect doesn't get the results from the system. The prospect gets the results from the advisor. So the advisor at that point has information about the prospect's assets and retirement income and things like that, and savings rates and whatnot. So they can decide, in a sense, how much time they want to spend with that prospect. If it's not somebody that they feel is necessarily a good fit, they could simply email the report to that prospect and be done with it. If it's somebody that they feel like they may be able to provide greater value at, and other services, then they'll probably want to spend a little bit more time. They may even want to go through a more comprehensive exercise at that point. So that's also a good question. Thank you.
Two more questions. One came in actually offline. This question is more about the technical aspects of the questionnaire. What is the client or the prospect user experience like? Are the questions overly technical?
Yeah, so the willingness section is not technical at all, and resembles the kinds of things that most advisors have used because it is a personality profile. You saw some screenshots of what we call the ability section, which is really where you'd model cash flows. The screenshots I used here were the advisor's workflow. So some advisors will go through the exercise live with a client. Live could be via screen sharing tool, doesn't have to necessarily be sitting next to them. The Tolerisk is all cloud-based, of course. But alternatively, you can have the client, or for that matter, prospect, fill out what we call the investor worksheet. That's sending the client a link of sorts. And that process has a different look and feel. It's a little more like a TurboTax style interview where it's saying, hi, how old are you? Are you married? Are you retired? Do you save money every month? It's kind of going through question by question, and it allows the client or the prospect to skip questions. It allows them to tag a question for discussion with their advisor. Tolerisk is also looking for inconsistencies, and so in doing that, it's not going to alert the client or prospect to that, but it will alert the advisor to it. So the advisor can decide how to deal with and perhaps speak to the client who says, I expect all the upsides when the market goes up, and I expect none of the downsides when it goes down. The advisor usually will want to use that as a little bit of a teachable moment. It also flags things for the advisor when the client or the prospect answers something that is likely a mistake. Again, it doesn't correct the client or prospect, but if the client answers the question about how much they contribute to their employer 401k every month with $487,000, well, Tolerisk knows that that's an error, but it's not going to correct the client. It will flag it for the advisor. So the advisor will have a lot of information when they review to decide, how they want to approach it. Not that those things are necessarily that common, but I'm sure advisors on this call have experienced things that would make this not a surprise if they had a client that didn't answer a question quite right.
Okay. And here's an interesting question. Is Tolerisk integrated with any other fintech tools like financial planning or CRM?
Yeah, so it's a big focus for us this year. We've had a lot of requests, as have some of the big vendors. What I will tell you is the 5 most requested integrations, not in any order, are Naviplan, eMoney, Money Guide Pro, Redtail, and Orion. We are in discussions with all of them. I do expect those integrations to occur this year. I really can't tell you which is going to be first, and there's still some discussion about what level of integration, as Neil is obviously you're an expert in. There are sort of different kinds and different levels of integration, but that is absolutely a focus and something that our clients are asking for, not only of us but also of those technologies as well. If you have specific technologies, whether one of the ones I mentioned or others, feel free to let us know. You can email us. You can email me directly, frankly. You can email me, mark@tolerisk.com, and I love to get that information. And also let your other vendors know, because it helps them prioritize just the same as it helps us prioritize. That's a good one. Any other questions, Neil?
Yeah, I think just one last one, which is, is there any special pricing or discounts available through any organizations, and how do we find out more?
Yeah, we do have some affinity relationships. In fact, we really appreciate, Neil, you having us here today, and we have something special for your clients. We can't announce it on the call because, of course, not everybody dialed in is a QuonWarrene client, but you certainly can ask Neil or his staff on a special referral code for QuonWarrene clients. We also have affiliations with some large broker dealers and custodians, as well as some other regulatory type consultants. So, I don't want to plug anybody specifically, but definitely check with your custodian or your broker dealer. Check with anybody that's providing you regulatory type consulting, and certainly check with Neil and company as well. So that's a great question. We're happy to do it. And by the way, if there are other entities that you would like to see us develop an affiliation with, we certainly like those introductions, and we're happy to explore those things. And if it makes sense for everybody, we're happy to do that as well.
Excellent. Well, Mark, we thank you for your time. I would say, as we wrap up and in your parting comments, why don't you remind everybody where they can find out more information about Tolerisk and how they set up more time to speak with you if they want more one-on-one review of the system?
Sure. The best thing to go really is to go to Tolerisk.com, and you'll see up there you can take a complimentary trial. It's totally unrestricted. You can do absolutely everything. You can upload your logo. You can upload your disclosure language. You can even embed it on your website. The only restriction is it's only good for 10 calendar days. So you sign up for it when you have the time to really use it. We absolutely want you to use it as much as possible. We find advisors that use it, frankly, they buy it. So it's pretty self-serving for us. You can also sign up for a demo. And I still do some demos myself, and we have other folks here that do demos as well. And it's a great way to really see the technology firsthand. If you have a larger organization, we can set up one for the whole organization, and we'll record it and replay it and make it available. But you're welcome to sign up for a one-on-one demo with one of our folks too. And that's, again, right on the website. There's a little button that says demo.
Well, excellent. Again, Mark, I want to just thank you so much for your time today. You covered a lot of ground and really opened my eyes to really the science of risk assessment. So thank you for your time and your comments today. Thank you for really sharing with our audience, what it means to really kind of take a different look at fiduciary standards. So, and most importantly, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending today. We know that your time is very valuable, so we hope you're finding value out of the monthly webinars we are doing. Please remember that the QuonWarrene Financial Technology Spotlight occurs every month on the first Tuesday of the month at 4 p.m. Eastern. And we have some exciting guest speakers lined up in the months to come. So please visit the QuonWarrene website at www.quonwarrene.com. Follow the link to the Financial Technology Spotlight and sign up to listen to any of our upcoming webinars, as well as to listen to any of our prior guest speakers. You can also follow us on Twitter at QuonWarrene. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you on a future Financial Technology Spotlight.
Thank you so much for having me, Neil. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Take care, everyone.